A disabled woman arrives in a quiet, unremarkable town. She rarely speaks, always keeps to herself, and moves around in a wheelchair. The locals quickly get used to her presence, never asking questions. Local thugs begin to mock her, unaware of who they're dealing with. When the time comes, she strikes first, and without mercy. She lost her legs, but not her mission. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, because many more thrilling tales are coming your way. Natalie Alden was accustomed to the wide sky above the lonely roads leading into Stonebridge, a small mountain town on the outskirts of a sprawling pine forest. She was a former Marine Corps staff sergeant who had returned from overseas deployments with devastating injuries that left her in a wheelchair. At first glance, she seemed like any other veteran, quietly rebuilding her life in a humble place far from the bustle of big cities. Yet beneath that unassuming exterior lay a secret that only a handful of individuals knew. She was an undercover operative for a specialized division within federal law enforcement. Meanwhile, it had been 6 months since she took up residence in Stonebridge under the guise of a reclusive resident who tended to keep to herself. Most of the townspeople saw her as a quiet newcomer who paid in cash and spoke politely but without warmth. They whispered that she had once served her country with distinction before coming home injured. They saw a wheelchair, old scars, and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. Few suspected that she maintained regular contact with a handler several states away, and even fewer noticed the subtle adjustments she made to her wheelchair. With cunning modifications, she had turned it into a clandestine weapons platform, capable of hiding small arms and advanced surveillance devices that were unknown to all but the top ranks of her agency. Meanwhile, Stonebridge was no random location. Rumors had circulated about an arms trafficking syndicate known as the Iron Serpents, a group of ruthless criminals operating under the leadership of a man named Jacob Grady. He was a tall figure with a heavy beard and an unsettling calm. Grady had transformed the Iron Serpents from a disorganized band of thrill-seekers into a lucrative criminal network specializing in illegal weapons distribution. Investigators believed that the Iron Serpents were only a piece of a larger puzzle, with potential ties to higher-level figures operating out of state. Natalie's mission involved infiltrating their innermost ranks to expose the entire operation. She had no illusions about the danger. She remembered that every infiltration carried the risk of betrayal, ambush, or worse. But she intended to see it through, one way or another. Meanwhile, during her first weeks in Stonebridge, she deliberately maintained a low profile, frequenting only 2 places with any consistency: a small diner along the main street and a local supply store where she picked up groceries and hardware. The diner was owned by a sympathetic local named Calvin Maynard, a middle-aged man who had seen enough tragedy in life to welcome any veteran with a kind word. He offered her simple meals at discounted prices and never pried too deeply into her personal affairs, sensing perhaps that she preferred solitude. Despite her inclination to remain distant, she found herself exchanging polite acknowledgments with him. Now and then, she allowed just enough conversation to keep him convinced she was merely another wounded soul seeking peace. Meanwhile, in truth, Natalie spent much of her time observing the townsfolk from the vantage point of her wheelchair. She memorized their schedules, assessed who might be quietly supporting the Iron Serpents, and learned how the local authorities functioned. The Stonebridge Police Department was small, staffed by a few dedicated officers who were either unaware of the criminal elements or too overwhelmed to confront them. Natalie's agency had quietly arranged for the police chief to cooperate when the moment came to strike, though the chief himself knew little about her direct involvement. While the chief recognized the presence of an undercover asset, he never guessed that the calm woman in the wheelchair was the crucial link to dismantling a massive arms trafficking scheme. Meanwhile, the Iron Serpents would appear in groups of 3 or 4 at odd hours, rumbling through the narrow roads on modified motorcycles. Their emblem, a coiled serpent with metallic scales, was displayed on their jackets. They were instantly recognizable, bringing with them an air of intimidation that most locals had learned to accept with resigned silence. The group's influence began to show. Several small businesses had closed under suspicious circumstances, properties changed hands abruptly, and a sense of mounting tension rippled through the community. Whispered stories suggested that the Iron Serpents had taken over a disused sawmill near the edge of the forest, turning it into a makeshift headquarters for their illicit activities. Natalie had glimpsed them carrying crates off the back of trucks, though she did not yet know the contents. She suspected that these were shipments of illegal firearms and ammunition being stored temporarily before distribution elsewhere. Meanwhile, one rainy afternoon, she found herself in the diner, listening through a concealed earpiece that connected to a directional microphone hidden within her wheelchair's frame. The microphone picked up faint voices from the far corner of the diner, where two members of the Iron Serpents had stationed themselves. They were discussing a new arrival expected within the next week, a large shipment that would pass through the old logging roads. They made cryptic references to a man named Reagan Conley, who seemed to have enough influence to make even Jacob Grady cautious. Natalie's training taught her to interpret the subtle clues. This was not just another routine delivery but something more significant, possibly a new type of weapon or a link to a larger consortium of arms brokers. Meanwhile, she quietly left the diner without meeting anyone's eyes, braving the downpour as she maneuvered her wheelchair onto the wet sidewalk. Her home was a small, single-story building on the outskirts of town, chosen primarily for its secluded nature. She had spent time fortifying it internally, ensuring she had a secure basement area where she could store her equipment. The building's exterior resembled any other humble home, blending into Stonebridge's rustic character. Inside, however, was an array of advanced surveillance gear, a communications console, and a lockbox containing multiple forms of weaponry disguised as everyday items. Meanwhile, Natalie locked the door behind her, then moved to a table in the corner of her living room, pushing aside innocuous postcards and local newspaper clippings to reveal a hidden digital console. She meticulously reviewed the audio feed recorded earlier, amplifying the conversation to catch the mention of Reagan Conley's name again. She typed brief notes, referencing the next possible date for the shipment. Her contact logs showed no new messages, which meant her agency either had nothing pressing to share or was leaving her to gather more intel on her own. Meanwhile, days later, Natalie ventured out under cover of darkness, rolling through side streets to approach the sawmill from a concealed angle. She had discovered a vantage point between two rotting log piles, thick with moss and old pine needles. From there, she could observe a side entrance. The Iron Serpents had installed large floodlights around the perimeter, patrolling periodically. She counted at least 5 men in rotation, each armed with handguns or shotguns. The operation was no haphazard venture. These individuals carried themselves like professionals, and the security perimeter seemed well planned. Meanwhile, she listened intently through another specialized microphone. Over the course of 3 hours, the group discussed the arrival of a heavily modified truck rumored to be carrying more than just standard rifles. One voice suggested that the cargo contained prototypes from a facility in Eastern Europe, while another speculated about high-grade explosives. Either way, the conversation confirmed that the Iron Serpents were preparing for a major deal, and that Jacob Grady was personally overseeing security. Meanwhile, the next morning, Natalie acted as though her evening had been spent at home. She made a show of wheeling herself to the diner just before noon, allowing the local residents and the Iron Serpents to see her calm, methodical routine. She deliberately flinched slightly whenever an Iron Serpent walked past her, perpetuating the image of a timid, wounded veteran who posed no threat. While finishing her simple meal, she overheard one of them muttering about that night's meeting at the old gravel quarry. The name of Reagan Conley came up again, with an undertone of both respect and fear. Meanwhile, in the early afternoon, she visited the local library, which was rarely used, especially on weekdays. The librarian had grown to appreciate Natalie's quiet presence, often pointing her toward historical records or helping her find references to old property lines in the region. On that day, Natalie requested obscure records related to the land around the sawmill and the gravel quarry. The library's digital archives contained references to closed logging roads that connected these two sites through a winding path in the forest. She suspected that the truck with the weapons shipment might travel along those hidden roads to avoid detection. She took note of each possible route, aware that the next step would involve deciding where best to intercept them or at least observe the exchange. Meanwhile, as night approached, she found herself in the basement of her house, preparing for a more active form of reconnaissance. She laid out a folded tarp that contained specialized gear, a compact sidearm outfitted with a suppressor, lightweight ballistic panels designed to strap onto her wheelchair, a small drone disguised as a bird, and a tool kit for infiltration. She methodically checked each item, ensuring they all functioned within normal parameters. The modifications to her wheelchair were extensive: a hidden compartment that could store her sidearm, a set of reinforced wheels, and a battery system that could silently power her movement. The standard squeak that most wheelchairs produced had been minimized, allowing her near-silent travel under low-noise conditions. Meanwhile, shortly before midnight, she traveled several miles outside of town, parking her van, an inconspicuous old model with no distinguishing features, on a dirt path. The wheelchair emerged smoothly down a mechanical ramp. She activated the drone and sent it gliding low over the trees toward the gravel quarry. Through a small receiver on her wrist, she watched a live feed as the drone approached the perimeter. She observed vehicles parked in a loose circle. Men with rifles patrolled near portable floodlights. The atmosphere was tense. Meanwhile, Jacob Grady stood out from the rest. He wore the Iron Serpent's emblem on a heavy jacket and kept a hand near his firearm at all times. Next to him stood two other individuals, one sporting an expensive leather coat with foreign lettering on the back. Natalie was not close enough to catch the conversation, but she identified multiple crates stacked near the edge of the quarry. The distinctive shape of rifles protruded from open containers, and the men occasionally glanced inside with guarded expressions. She spotted an older man with a thick build who had an air of authority even greater than Grady's. This had to be Reagan Conley, rumored to be the higher-level contact bridging local and international arms supplies. Meanwhile, minutes later, more vehicles arrived. The tension rose, and Natalie counted 7 additional men, each heavily armed. The group formed a circle around 2 new arrivals whose faces were partially obscured by the darkness. A small contraption that looked like a weapon case was presented, and the older man in the thick coat inspected it carefully. One of the new arrivals stood with a stiff posture that suggested a background in military or paramilitary activities. Natalie recognized that stance, the feet spaced evenly, weight distributed in a balanced manner, scanning the environment as if every corner might hide a threat. Meanwhile, a slight disturbance caused the group to shift their positions. The floodlights flickered. Someone had brought a portable generator that sputtered now and then, causing darkness to momentarily descend. In those fleeting seconds of near blackness, Natalie maneuvered her drone for a closer look. She managed to glimpse the face of the second new arrival, though she did not recognize him. She recorded the feed nonetheless, suspecting that her agency would be able to identify him through advanced facial recognition. Meanwhile, after a few moments, the group began sealing the crates, and the older man gestured toward a black SUV parked on the side. The watchers posted at the quarry perimeter checked the tree line repeatedly, as though expecting trouble. Natalie eased the drone backward, unwilling to risk detection. When the meeting finally dispersed, the vehicles rolled out in intervals. Jacob Grady and his entourage left last, turning onto the old logging road that paralleled the forest. Natalie stored the drone, re-entered the van, and returned to her small home in Stonebridge, meticulously reviewing the collected footage. Meanwhile, she reported her findings through an encrypted channel to her handler, who responded with a single coded message instructing her to continue gathering details and to remain cautious. The next day, the entire town sensed a quiet undercurrent of unease. The Iron Serpents roamed the streets with more aggression, as though searching for any sign of infiltration or betrayal. Natalie maintained her usual habits, visiting the diner, chatting briefly with Calvin Maynard, and stopping by the supply store, but she felt their eyes on her. It was a reminder that any misstep could lead to exposure. Meanwhile, that afternoon, a chance encounter shifted the balance of her operation. 3 of the Iron Serpents had parked their motorcycles outside the diner, leaning against the worn bricks. One of them, a tall figure with a shaved head, crossed paths with Natalie as she tried to exit the building. He blocked the door with his boot, eyeing her wheelchair and the scars on her face. He smirked in a way that made it clear he viewed her as an easy target. He muttered a threat-laden comment about how she did not belong in Stonebridge and should mind her own business. Natalie's expression remained impassive. Internally, she felt a surge of adrenaline, but she kept her composure, showing no outward sign of defiance or fear. Meanwhile, the tension grew when Jacob Grady himself appeared from around the corner. He regarded Natalie with narrowed eyes, as though assessing her significance. Then he nodded to his men, signaling them to leave her be. The tall one stepped back with a sneer, and Natalie wordlessly maneuvered her chair out onto the sidewalk, continuing on her way. As she turned the corner, she could still feel their stares drilling into the back of her head. She needed to ensure that moment had not aroused undue suspicion. But something about Jacob Grady's look gave her pause. It was neither dismissive nor entirely curious. It left an uneasy feeling in her gut, one she could not easily shake. Meanwhile, retreating into the safety of her house that night, she began preparing contingencies. She double-checked the hidden compartments in her wheelchair, tested the ballistic panels, and ensured that her firearms were in perfect working condition. She also reviewed an alternate identity in case she needed to flee Stonebridge and re-establish contact elsewhere. Yet her orders were clear: remain embedded, continue the infiltration, and wait for the right moment to strike. She was close to unearthing something far bigger than local thugs or a single illicit shipment. The mention of Reagan Conley and his broad network suggested that this operation had the potential to undermine entire corridors of law enforcement if not stopped in time. Meanwhile, in the following days, Natalie's routine encounters with various iron serpents escalated in intensity. She overheard conversations about another meeting at a remote location across the county line, near a place called Ravenwood Bluff. She deduced that Ravenwood Bluff was a strategic vantage point well suited for clandestine transactions given its isolation. Surveillance drones would have a harder time navigating its steep terrain. She also heard bits of gossip that some local residents had gone missing, fueling her suspicions that the iron serpents might be silencing potential informants or witnesses. Meanwhile, she recognized that the time had come to act more decisively. At midnight, she packed her gear and ventured back into the forest near the sawmill, seeking a vantage that would give her a clearer view of what the iron serpents were storing inside. She discovered, to her surprise, that new fencing had been erected, complete with motion-activated cameras. Whatever was happening, it was accelerating. Pulling the hood of her jacket tighter, she slipped from tree to tree, her wheelchair almost silent against the damp ground. Eventually, she found an unprotected angle where she could use a small foldable ladder attachment on her chair to elevate herself just enough to see over a portion of the fence. Meanwhile, she glimpsed not just crates but what appeared to be larger containers marked with symbols used for hazardous materials or advanced weaponry. The contents, if real, were more dangerous than she had initially assumed. She retrieved a small thermal imaging device from her side pouch, scanning the area for potential guards. Despite the late hour, there was significant activity inside, with men moving equipment, vehicles idling, and the bright halo of floodlights. She felt a cold certainty creeping through her. The iron serpents were not merely part of a minor distribution ring, they were a well-funded, well-supplied operation. Meanwhile, retreating carefully, Natalie returned home and transmitted her findings. Early the next morning, she received confirmation that a specialized federal team was being readied for a coordinated strike. However, they needed exact timings and confirmation of the cargo's route. That meant Natalie was on her own to acquire that final piece of intelligence. She made a mental note to keep her presence as inconspicuous as possible, but an uneasy premonition told her that the iron serpents were already on heightened alert. Meanwhile, the ensuing tension around Stonebridge became palpable. Even the townspeople who tried to keep their heads down could sense that something was about to happen. Natalie found fewer friendly smiles and more anxious glances, as if everyone feared some storm about to break. The weather itself turned ominous, with dark clouds gathering over the mountains, threatening heavy rain. It was the perfect backdrop for a confrontation that felt inevitable. Meanwhile, she had one last piece to secure: the exact time and location of the next major handoff, the one that would involve the large shipment rumored to involve prototypes or possibly explosives. She believed that information rested with either Jacob Grady or Reagan Conley, and she had no illusions about the risk of trying to glean it from either of them. Yet she had spent months preparing for such a moment. She reminded herself that the wheelchair was not a limitation but a tactical advantage, a piece of the puzzle that her enemies underestimated. Her training had taught her to exploit every misconception. Meanwhile, as dusk fell, Natalie revisited the diner under the guise of having a routine dinner. She pretended to struggle with the door, feigning momentary frustration to keep up the illusion of helplessness. Inside, she noticed a sudden hush. 3 iron serpents sat at a table near the window, speaking in hushed tones. At the counter stood a stranger with sharp features, wearing a leather jacket with no emblem. Natalie recognized that silent tension that occurs when 2 predators occupy the same space. She found a spot at the far corner, her back to a wall, methodically ordering a modest meal from Calvin. Meanwhile, the hush broke when the stranger left the diner, and the 3 iron serpents exchanged pointed looks. One quietly muttered that the meeting at Ravenwood Bluff had been rescheduled for the next night due to new security concerns. Another insisted that they bring extra muscle because Grady expected unexpected guests. The mention of that location and timing was all Natalie needed. She finished her meal, thanked Calvin with a simple nod, and left. She knew that the next 24 hours would be critical. She had to confirm the route, signal her team, and then position herself to ensure the entire ring was dismantled. Meanwhile, despite the urgency, she took every precaution, returning home without drawing attention. The storm broke soon after, rain hammering her roof. Thunder rattled the windows, and she worked steadily, checking her gear and sending out coded signals to her handler. The instructions came back swiftly: be in position by the old logging road leading to Ravenwood Bluff, gather photographic evidence, then transmit a green light for the strike team. She closed her eyes for a moment, recalling her days in the Marine Corps, the day she survived an ambush that took her legs but never broke her resolve. She remembered the vow she made in the hospital to continue serving in any capacity possible, refusing to let her injuries define her future. Meanwhile, this was the culminating point. Months of intelligence gathering, nights of solitary stakeouts, precarious infiltration, and careful planning had led to this juncture. She intended to face the Iron Serpents head-on, to dismantle their operation and whatever alliances they had cultivated. And if that included Reagan Conley and whoever stood behind him, she was ready to see it through. She knew it would be dangerous, that accidents could happen, that betrayal could come from unexpected quarters, but she refused to falter. Meanwhile, morning arrived gray and cold, the rain slowing to a faint drizzle. Natalie loaded her wheelchair and her equipment into the back of the van, quietly leaving Stonebridge before dawn. She drove along deserted roads, heading for an overgrown trail that would serve as her vantage point above Ravenwood Bluff. Although the terrain would be difficult, she had chosen this route precisely because it was unlikely that the Iron Serpents or their lookouts would be watching. By the time the sun rose behind a veil of storm clouds, she was situated in a hidden spot, scanning the area with high-powered binoculars. Meanwhile, this would be her final watch before the plan swung into motion. She steadied her breathing, focusing not on her physical limitations but on the strength she had honed through years of service and months of stealth. The memory of the ambush and the hospital bed flickered in her thoughts again, but she pushed it aside. She had made her choice long ago. Now, she would see it through, culminating in the confrontation that might determine the fate of Stonebridge and beyond. She waited, watchful, determined, ready for the inevitable collision with the Iron Serpents, and whatever forces lay beyond them, on the horizon of Ravenwood Bluff. Meanwhile, Natalie waited in the pre-dawn gloom, situated behind dense foliage that overlooked a dirt road winding toward the remote expanse known as Ravenwood Bluff. She remained motionless for hours as the overcast sky gradually lightened from pitch black to a dim gray. The forest around her was alive with the soft hush of wind brushing through evergreen branches and the occasional shuffle of small creatures. Her wheelchair, modified to maneuver in uneven terrain, sat anchored in place with a set of retractable stabilizers, preventing unwanted movement on the gentle slope. Every so often, she lifted compact binoculars to scan the distant horizon, anticipating signs of the Iron Serpent's convoy. Meanwhile, she was not merely gathering intelligence this time. She was certain that events would escalate sharply once the trucks arrived. Her instructions had been to observe, relay final confirmations, and trigger the strike. Yet she knew operations in the field rarely unfolded as cleanly as outlined in mission briefings. Her mind drifted back to the moment she lost her legs, how swiftly and chaotically everything collapsed under enemy fire, and how the best-laid plans could unravel in an instant. Remembering those vivid details made her hyper-alert to the possibility that the Iron Serpents might have changed their route or schedule. She forced herself to remain patient, scanning the road in incremental sweeps, aware that a single glimpse of headlights could herald the start of the entire operation. Meanwhile, the hours crawled forward. The drizzle returned with a steady patter that coated her hood and glistened on the surrounding tree branches. She shifted slightly, checking the feed from a small camera she had hidden near the sawmill 2 nights earlier. The camera, linked to a specialized receiver in her wheelchair, showed increased activity around the perimeter fence. Several men were loading crates into the back of 2 large trucks. Natalie recognized the logo on the side of one of the trailers, a false design that had been used in prior arms-smuggling incidents across the region. She tapped a brief message into her encrypted console, transmitting updated details of the cargo transfer to her handler. Meanwhile, no direct reply arrived, indicating that her superiors were awaiting final confirmation. She took a steadying breath. Her vantage point in the forest was about 2 miles from the sawmill, on a route she believed would be used by the convoy to reach Ravenwood Bluff. The muddy ruts of the old logging roads would challenge conventional vehicles, but these trucks likely had modifications for off-road transport. She suspected the Iron Serpents had scouted this path in advance, placing lookouts or hidden spotters to keep watch. That suspicion made her particularly cautious. She had chosen her position carefully, finding a dip in the terrain where she could avoid any direct line of sight from potential patrols. Meanwhile, a subtle vibration in her wheelchair's console alerted her to a new transmission. The message was short, instructing her to verify the number of vehicles and confirm the presence of either Jacob Grady or Reagan Conley. The agency needed indisputable evidence to justify deploying specialized tactical units deep into the forest. Natalie adjusted her camera's range, powering up a thermal imager hidden in a small dome beneath the wheelchair's seat. Through it, she captured the heat signatures of 4 men at the edge of the sawmill property, along with the rumble of diesel engines from what appeared to be a pair of trucks and 2 smaller SUVs. She identified Jacob Grady's silhouette by his height and build, recalling the tension from her brief encounter with him in town. She uploaded a still image from the thermal feed, hoping it would suffice as proof of his involvement. Meanwhile, a half-hour later, the convoy rumbled onto the road. Thick tires churned up mud, and headlights cut through the lingering darkness. Natalie watched the vehicles advance in a staggered formation, placing one SUV at the front, followed by the first truck, then the second, and a final SUV bringing up the rear. She recalled the rumor that these vehicles carried either high-grade rifles or sophisticated explosives. The real possibility existed that the Iron Serpents were trafficking hardware far beyond the typical black market arms. She prepared her small handheld drone for launch, knowing it might be the only way to track them without risking direct confrontation. The plan was to let the convoy pass, follow at a safe distance, and observe their arrival at Ravenwood Bluff. Meanwhile, the moment the vehicles crossed into her line of sight, she controlled her breathing, trying to still the slight tremor in her hands. The lead SUV crept ahead slowly, scanning the sides of the road. She noticed how the passenger window was rolled halfway down, allowing a figure inside to shine a handheld spotlight into the trees. Natalie flattened herself behind the thick trunk of a pine, pressing a button to maintain the drone in silent standby mode. Her chair was camouflaged against ferns and low-hanging branches. She watched, barely daring to move, as the SUV's light beam swept past her position. The passenger's silhouette paused for a moment, then continued moving the spotlight along the tree line. The rumble of engines grew louder, then gradually faded as the vehicles disappeared beyond a bend in the road. Meanwhile, she waited 5 minutes, giving the convoy a head start before activating the drone. It lifted from its small platform with a nearly inaudible hum, staying low beneath the canopy. She guided it up onto a parallel route that hovered above the muddy track. From her console, she observed the flicker of headlights as the convoy made steady progress toward Ravenwood Bluff. She trailed them at a safe distance, taking care to keep the drone's altitude low enough to avoid detection by any watchers in the rear SUV. Heavy clouds shielded the area from early daylight, helping her maintain secrecy. Meanwhile, about 2 miles later, the trucks slowed down at a fork in the road, presumably verifying which branch led toward their meeting point. They turned down the narrower path that snaked past a ridge of rocky outcrops. Natalie's intel suggested that beyond that ridge lay the open clearing of Ravenwood Bluff. She found it ironic that a place with such a sweeping view of the valley was hidden behind thick clusters of pine and granite walls. As the vehicles advanced, the drone's camera relayed additional signs of heavy security, multiple armed individuals standing near the edges of the clearing, masked by trees, each carrying what seemed like semi-automatic rifles. Meanwhile, Natalie maneuvered herself carefully, pushing branches aside to relocate her vantage point. She aimed to move closer without alerting the iron serpents. The mud was challenging, but her modified wheelchair handled the uneven ground with less noise than a footstep might have made. She had practiced for months to navigate such terrain, focusing on how to maintain stealth even in adverse conditions. The tension in her muscles grew as she realized that one miscalculation could lead her straight into a patrol. She thought back to earlier infiltration exercises during her Marine Corps days, remembering how to keep her heartbeat steady and her movements deliberate. Meanwhile, finally, she reached a small ledge that overlooked the open bluff. From there, she could see a broader sweep of the clearing. A makeshift platform had been constructed at the far side, presumably for offloading crates. Temporary floodlights had been positioned around the area, not yet switched on, but they would likely be used once darkness fully settled again. The trucks parked in a semicircle, and men began unloading crates. In the shifting gloom, she distinguished Jacob Grady's frame standing near the first truck. A second figure, shorter and bulkier, seemed to issue orders while pointing at specific crates. Natalie recognized him from the drone footage at the gravel quarry, one of Conley's close associates, though she had not confirmed his name. Meanwhile, she noticed a solitary figure step out of the second SUV with an aura of authority surpassing even Grady's. Taller than his companions, he wore a heavy jacket with no visible insignia. Though she could not see his face clearly, the posture and the way the others deferred to him strongly suggested that this was Reagan Conley himself. He surveyed the clearing, occasionally gesturing to the cargo. The men in the area moved quickly to obey his directives, adjusting the placement of equipment and shifting crates onto reinforced pallets. Natalie began capturing high-resolution images through her drone, systematically logging each step of the operation. Meanwhile, she felt the weight of the moment. If she obtained clear evidence of Conley's direct involvement, her superiors would launch the strike immediately. The Iron Serpents, the corrupt network they maintained, and any external partners in arms trafficking would become vulnerable to a sweeping takedown. She allowed herself a fleeting sense of victory, though she knew the most dangerous part was still to come. A cornered adversary was always the most lethal. Meanwhile, suddenly, the thermal feed from her drone picked up additional movement from deeper in the forest. 6 new heat signatures approached from the west, fanning out into a tactical formation rather than strolling casually. They seemed too organized to be local hunters or random hikers. Natalie realized they were likely part of an external group looking to acquire whatever arms the Iron Serpents were selling. The possibility of a double cross or a power move flickered through her mind. Tensions always ran high when two heavily armed factions met in a secluded area with minimal oversight. Meanwhile, she transmitted a coded message, indicating that more hostile elements had appeared. The response from her handler was immediate: proceed with caution, confirm all hostile elements, and be ready to call in the strike. She recognized the unsaid implication that if a firefight broke out prematurely, the specialized federal units would lose the element of surprise. Timing was crucial. The infiltration strategy hinged on letting the Iron Serpents and their prospective buyers reveal their full intentions and possibly their broader network. A partial takedown might leave key players at large. Meanwhile, Natalie kept the drone hovering at the perimeter, switching the camera between normal and thermal modes. The newly arrived group moved into the clearing. One carried a bulky metal case, another shouldered what appeared to be a suppressed rifle. They stopped a short distance from Conley and Grady, forming a line that almost looked ceremonial. From her vantage point, she watched the body language. Conley tilted his head, as though appraising the newcomers, while Grady held back, scanning the tree line with calculated wariness. Meanwhile, as the meeting proceeded in near silence, no voices carried to her position, Natalie noticed a subtle shift in the men's stances. A few from the Iron Serpent stepped to the side, hands resting on their weapons. The newcomers fanned out, forming an open semicircle. It appeared that neither side fully trusted the other, and both were prepared for a violent confrontation. With her drone carefully angled, she captured glimpses of the metal case being opened, revealing cylindrical objects that glinted with a dull metallic sheen. She enlarged the camera feed and recognized them as either mortar shells or some specialized form of projectile. This was no ordinary shipment of rifles or sidearms. Whatever these devices were, they carried the potential for far greater destruction. Meanwhile, she knew the moment had arrived. She had collected enough evidence to confirm a significant, organized deal involving advanced weaponry. She typed in the final confirmation code and pressed send. The next steps would unfold with methodical precision. The strike team had staged themselves in a distant county, ready to mobilize via helicopter insertion. Once they launched, the entire area of Ravenwood Bluff would be sealed off. The success of the operation hinged on limiting the Iron Serpent's escape routes, which meant striking quickly and in a coordinated manner. Meanwhile, the minutes passed in tense apprehension. From her vantage, she saw the men exchanging items: crates for the metal case, logs being recorded on a tablet device, phone screens glowing in the dim light. Conley appeared to sign off on something, then gestured for his men to begin loading. Grady, meanwhile, surveyed the edges of the clearing, occasionally pausing as if he sensed something amiss. Natalie feared that the presence of the drone might be discovered if it ventured too close. She powered down its active scanning to reduce the risk, leaving only a minimal feed that would be less detectable. Meanwhile, lightning flickered across the sky, and a low growl of thunder rolled over the forest. The weather seemed ready to unleash a torrent at any moment. The arrival of a storm could be both an advantage and a hazard. It might mask the approach of the strike helicopters, but it could also complicate communications and hamper visibility. Natalie's console vibrated, indicating the strike team had lifted off. She braced for the chaos that would ensue when they arrived. Meanwhile, from a distance, she picked up the faint thud of rotor blades echoing through the mountain pass. The timing suggested that the helicopters were moving in swiftly. She monitored the Iron Serpents below for any sign that they had detected the inbound team. Several minutes passed with no reaction, but then one of the newcomers, possibly more alert than the rest, looked skyward, scanning the cloud-filled sky. He said something to Conley, causing all heads to turn upward. The clearing erupted in hurried activity as men rushed to secure the crates or load them back onto trucks. The impending confrontation was becoming inevitable, and Natalie realized that if the Iron Serpents decided to flee, they might scatter in every direction, forcing the strike team to split their efforts. Meanwhile, she needed to buy time and force them to remain at Ravenwood Bluff long enough for the helicopters to deploy. She quickly switched the drone's camera back to active mode, found the parked trucks, and targeted their engines with a small device that emitted an electromagnetic pulse in a very narrow range. It was a feature that she had used in previous operations, but never in open terrain like this. She let it charge, then triggered it, disabling the electrical systems of at least one truck. The effect would be partial, but hopefully enough to slow down the entire convoy. Meanwhile, the reaction was immediate. The second truck sputtered and died, headlights flickering off. The men around it shouted, scrambling to diagnose the problem. Conley paced angrily, while Grady barked orders. The sense of urgency intensified as they tried to figure out whether a mechanical failure or sabotage had halted the vehicle. Natalie stayed low, certain that they would now be on guard for hidden attackers. She hoped the strike team was close because her interference would be difficult to conceal. Meanwhile, seconds later, the rotor noise grew louder. The iron serpents realized they were cornered, and chaos erupted. Shots rang out as some tried to fire into the sky, though that was more a gesture of defiance than a practical strategy. Others sprinted for cover behind crates or ducked into the tree line. Natalie watched as Conley moved with methodical calm, positioning himself behind a stack of pallets. Grady seemed more agitated, scanning for any sign of infiltration on the ground. Men from both factions were clearly prepared to defend themselves against a surprise assault. Meanwhile, then the forest lit up with the glow of helicopter spotlights piercing through the rolling clouds. The heavy sound of rotor wash pulsed overhead, shaking branches and scattering leaves. Ropes dropped, and silhouettes of heavily armed tactical officers descended rapidly. They fanned out, establishing a perimeter around the clearing. The plan was evidently to box in the smugglers, cutting off possible escape routes. Natalie stayed put, continuing to direct the drone from her vantage point, relaying real-time positions of the fleeing men to the strike team's command frequency. She could not directly speak to them, but her transmissions provided updated coordinates for any hostiles trying to slip away. Meanwhile, a fierce firefight erupted on the far side of the clearing. Gunshots echoed through the trees as muzzle flashes lit the gloom. The newcomers who had arrived with the metal case had retreated behind a makeshift barricade of crates, exchanging fire with the advancing federal agents. Conley directed some iron serpents to flank the tactical officers, but they found themselves pinned down when the second helicopter arrived, deploying more personnel. The operation was in full swing now, with multiple angles of engagement. Meanwhile, Natalie spotted Grady heading toward the disabled truck, apparently trying to retrieve something from inside. She zoomed in the drone's camera and saw him pulling out a black duffel bag before crouching behind the cab. She suspected the bag might contain critical documents, money, or specialized weapons that he wanted to rescue. She keyed a rapid note about his location, hoping that an agent on the ground would intercept him. However, Grady was not alone. A band of iron serpents, at least 4 men, were covering him from behind large shipping crates. Meanwhile, suddenly, another swirl of motion caught her eye. A group of the newcomers who had arrived from the west were making a break for the forest's edge, carrying the metal case. They seemed determined to preserve whatever dangerous payload it contained. Natalie realized that losing that case would be a catastrophic setback for the authorities. She switched vantage points, carefully guiding the drone after them while inputting their coordinates. She prayed that the strike team had the capacity to handle so many splintering escapes simultaneously. Meanwhile, down below, the lead helicopter pivoted to shine a spotlight on the fleeing group. Several loud flashes erupted, possibly tear gas canisters or flashbangs. The men carrying the case stumbled, momentarily disoriented by the sudden sensory onslaught. Federal agents capitalized on their confusion, advancing swiftly with disciplined, tactical movements. Natalie watched as at least one of the newcomers fired blindly into the haze, only to be tackled by an agent. The metal case fell into the mud. Partially opened, revealing cylindrical devices with blinking indicators. She felt an icy pang of alarm. This was not simple mortar ordnance. These devices carried electronic components reminiscent of advanced guidance or triggering mechanisms. Stopping them from leaving the site was clearly the highest priority. Meanwhile, Conley directed a small group of loyalists in a final stand near the center of the clearing, using the disabled truck and stacks of crates as makeshift cover. Muzzle flashes lit up the area, and intermittent bursts of muzzle thunder rattled the trees. Federal agents returned fire in measured volleys, gradually tightening the circle. It seemed that the strike team's planning was paying off. Conley's people were being driven to the clearing center, losing their earlier advantage of open space. Still, they fought back with a desperation that spoke to the high stakes involved. Natalie suspected many of them would rather die than be captured, especially if they had reason to believe convictions would follow swiftly. Meanwhile, even from her distance, she could sense the operation's intensity. The thunderstorm that had threatened earlier now broke overhead, drenching the scene in torrents of rain. Lightning flashes illuminated ghostly snapshots of the battle, revealing hunched figures behind crates or lying prone in the mud. The downpour also created a veil of mist, clinging to the ground and rising from the disturbed dirt. Shots continued to crack through the din of rainfall, though gradually they grew more sporadic. Meanwhile, Natalie inched closer, leaving her vantage point and maneuvering her wheelchair over saturated ground. She deactivated the drone to free up her full attention, occasionally pausing to listen for stray gunfire. She slipped behind a large boulder to reassess the clearing, noticing that the federal agents had gained near total control. Some members of the Iron Serpents had either surrendered or been forced to lie face down on the muddy ground. Others remained huddled under partial cover, apparently wounded or pinned down. Conley was nowhere in sight, neither was Grady. This concerned her. She scanned the edges of the clearing, suspecting that those two might be attempting a last-ditch escape. Meanwhile, her console chirped with a final message from her handler, indicating that the perimeter teams had locked down most exits, but a gap might exist along the southeast ridge, where the forest was dense and the terrain steep. She suspected that Conley might try to slip away there. She ventured deeper into the outskirts of the clearing, weaving between fallen branches. The rain pounded on the canopy above, saturating the ground into a slick morass. Each movement required concentration, for even her modified wheels threatened to lose traction in the sludge. Meanwhile, as she neared the southeastern approach, a burst of gunfire startled her. She froze, spotting a figure in a dark jacket stumbling through the undergrowth. In the flickering lightning, she recognized Jacob Grady, clutching the black duffel bag and glaring back over his shoulder. His left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly from a gunshot wound. Even injured, he pressed onward, determined to escape with whatever was in that bag. He had no idea Natalie was behind him in the darkness. Meanwhile, she watched as he attempted to find a path down the steep slope. The mud was unforgiving, and he slipped, sliding on his side, cursing under his breath. He clutched at a root and regained his footing, never letting go of the bag. Natalie silently navigated closer, a sidearm resting in a concealed compartment on her chair. She did not intend to draw attention to herself, and she knew that the strike team would be combing the area soon. Grady stumbled again, tearing at branches and slipping repeatedly. He was close enough that she could observe the tightness in his posture, the raggedness of his breathing. He clung to that duffel as though it were his last hope. Meanwhile, a flash of lightning revealed another figure emerging from the shadows, Reagan Conley, moving with more composure despite the slick conditions. He reached Grady, snatching the duffel with a furious intensity. Though Natalie could not hear him clearly, the body language suggested an argument. Perhaps Conley accused Grady of failure or betrayal. Grady clung to the bag, refusing to relinquish it fully. Conley tried to yank it away, and the two men nearly fell in the mud as they grappled. The entire scene was lit sporadically by lightning, with thunder booming overhead, giving it a surreal, nightmarish quality. Meanwhile, Natalie realized that, in their struggle, neither man noticed she was a short distance above them, partially hidden by thick underbrush. She considered her options. The simplest approach was to remain out of sight and let the strike team handle them. But there was a risk the men would escape if she did not intervene. She weighed the importance of that duffel bag. From Grady's determined grip, it could contain evidence critical to dismantling the entire operation. If they vanished into the forest, years of infiltration might be undone. Meanwhile, she quietly drew her sidearm and shifted forward. Her wheelchair's wide tread allowed her to inch closer without making too much noise, though she had to be mindful of every root and rock under the surface of the mud. At one point, she nearly lost her balance, forced to extend a stabilizer to keep from toppling. Through the cacophony of wind and rain, Conley and Grady continued to wrestle for possession of the bag, unaware of her presence. Meanwhile, suddenly, Conley wrenched the duffel free with a powerful tug, sending Grady sprawling. He glanced at the crumpled figure at his feet, then turned and hurried down the slope. Grady did not remain on the ground long. He launched himself after Conley with a fierce burst of energy. Natalie watched with a mix of caution and compulsion, her training urging her to find a stable vantage. She spotted a thick trunk near the slope, maneuvered behind it, and positioned herself. She fought the urge to call out or forcibly intervene. Her mission parameters were clear: gather intel, let the strike team corner the criminals, and avoid direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Yet with each second, the pair risked slipping beyond the perimeter. Meanwhile, as Grady closed the gap, Conley spun, violently swinging the bag at him. The strap caught Grady across the face, sending him stumbling again. Conley broke into a staggered run, skidding over roots and rocks, the duffel slung across his back. Grady lurched up, shouting in frustration though his words were lost in the storm. He charged recklessly down the slope, and this time he tackled Conley. Both men crashed into a small depression filled with muddy water. They clawed and kicked, each vying for control of the duffel. In the lightning's glare, Natalie glimpsed blood smeared on both men, uncertain whose it was. Meanwhile, she realized this was her moment to ensure neither escaped. She guided her wheelchair closer, sidearm raised, scanning for any sign of additional threats. At that instant, a crack of thunder boomed directly overhead, and the entire slope was lit up as if by a strobe light. Conley managed to wrest control of the bag once more, using his free hand to press down on Grady's injured shoulder. Grady writhed in agony, his energy fading. Conley rose to his feet, apparently resolved to leave Grady behind. Meanwhile, before Conley could take more than a few steps, a distant voice bellowed over the roar of the storm, urging both men to freeze. Natalie recognized the shapes of federal agents moving in, silhouettes among the slick tree trunks. A handful had broken from the main confrontation to pursue the stragglers. Conley hesitated, glancing around as if weighing whether to flee further. He clung to the duffel, expression twisted in frustration. Grady, lying prone, reached out in a feeble attempt to pull him back, perhaps unwilling to let him escape with the bag. A single shot rang out from somewhere in the darkness, whizzing through branches. Conley ducked and resumed his escape down the slope, ignoring Grady's outstretched arm. Meanwhile, Natalie carefully descended after them, flanking the agents. She wanted to ensure the duffel did not vanish. But she also knew how dangerous it was to place herself directly in a firefight. The swirling rain masked footfalls, so she proceeded slowly, letting the agents take the lead. She watched as two of them closed the distance on Grady, securing his arms with zip ties despite his curses and thrashing. Meanwhile, Conley vanished behind a clump of rock, leaving only faint footprints in the mud. The bag contained the potential to unravel every layer of the Iron Serpent's operation. He was determined not to lose it. Meanwhile, moments later, the agents spread out in a search formation, using handheld spotlights to sweep the slope. Natalie took a position near the top, using her vantage to scan for movement. The minutes ticked by with no sign of Conley, until one agent cursed in frustration, shining his light on the ridge. Deep tire tracks indicated someone had stashed a vehicle there, possibly an ATV hidden for a quick getaway. Natalie's heart sank. If Conley reached that ATV, he could vanish into the labyrinth of forest roads that riddled the region. She transmitted an alert, urging the perimeter teams to redirect to the southeast approach. Meanwhile, before she could do more, a roar of an engine cut through the noise of the storm. It came from lower down the slope, a place difficult for a large vehicle but feasible for something with strong off-road capability. Headlights flickered between tree trunks, revealing a small, powerful ATV. Conley was at the wheel, the duffel bag strapped to the seat behind him, mud flying as he wrestled the machine through the uneven terrain. The agents fired warning shots, but he twisted the throttle and accelerated past them, weaving between boulders. Natalie caught a glimpse of his determined scowl, drenched by rain, reflecting the raw desperation of a man who had lost everything except that bag. Meanwhile, one of the agents tried to pursue on foot, but the mud slowed him, and the ATV quickly gained distance. Another agent slipped, falling to his knees as the storm battered the ridge. Natalie realized that if Conley made it around the ridge's bend, he might find a path to slip under the perimeter. She glanced down at her wheelchair's instruments, flicking a switch that engaged a specialized traction control system. She knew the logging roads in that area better than most, having studied old maps. There was only one route Conley could take that did not lead into a dead end or a ravine. Meanwhile, she transmitted a short, urgent message to the strike team's command net, identifying a narrow logging trail that curved around the south side of the ridge. She advised them to block it immediately, or Conley would be gone. The console showed an acknowledgement, but she sensed from the scattered vantage readings that the team's resources were stretched. They were still rounding up stragglers in the clearing and the forest beyond. Conley had seized the perfect moment to exploit a gap. Meanwhile, faced with the possibility that he might outmaneuver the strike force, Natalie resolved to take a risk. She left the relative cover of the hillside and moved down to the old logging road, hoping to intercept Conley before he could escape the perimeter. Her wheelchair's wide off-road tires churned through mud, lightning occasionally showing glimpses of battered tree trunks on either side. The forest floor dropped sharply in places, but she navigated with familiarity, using carefully memorized terrain data. She tried to keep an ear out for the engine's noise, although the storm's fury made that nearly impossible. Meanwhile, minutes passed with no sign of Conley. She worried she might have guessed the wrong route. The storm was unrelenting, and each flash of lightning was followed by an echoing boom that reverberated through the valleys. The canopy dripped incessantly, saturating the ground. She nearly lost traction twice, forced to reverse and try a different approach. At last, she heard the distinct growl of the ATV's engine to her right, echoing as though bouncing off a narrow canyon. She oriented toward it, pushing through a screen of saplings that whipped her arms and shoulders. She found herself on a narrow trail with dense undergrowth on both sides. The ATV's headlights cut through the rain about 50 yards ahead. Conley had taken a moment to slow down, possibly evaluating how to proceed in the terrible conditions. Meanwhile, Natalie used the chance to close the distance. She powered her wheelchair forward, the engine nearly silent under the thunder. When Conley gunned the ATV again, she saw an opportunity. A downed tree lay across the road, partially blocking the path. Conley halted, weighed his options, then began maneuvering around it. The duffel bag remained strapped to the ATV's seat, and he seemed to be checking the road behind him nervously. She recognized his hesitation as a vulnerability. He could not move quickly while circumventing the obstacle. Meanwhile, she approached within a short distance, maintaining partial cover behind the thick trunk of the fallen tree. Conley did not see her in the dark. She steadied herself, one hand on the integrated armrest, the other gripping the sidearm. In her peripheral vision, she glimpsed a battered signpost that read, "Private Logging Road, Closed." If she allowed Conley to get beyond that sign, the terrain opened into winding foothills that stretched for miles. Federal agents would have a slim chance of catching him before he found a safe haven. She prepared to reveal herself, though she dreaded a direct confrontation with a cornered criminal. Yet the memory of everything the Iron Serpents had done, the missing townspeople, the advanced weapon deals, the intimidation, compelled her. She had come too far to let him slip away. Meanwhile, lightning flashed, reflecting in Conley's eyes as he glanced back. He suddenly froze, spotting movement on his left side. In his urgency, he attempted to maneuver the ATV around the tree, spraying mud into the air. Natalie braced, anticipating that he might accelerate away. Instead, he misjudged the slope, and the ATV lurched, nearly toppling. He lost control for a second, steadying the vehicle with his feet. In that moment, the duffel bag slid precariously on the seat, as if threatening to fall off. Meanwhile, Natalie moved forward to position herself at an angle. She realized he might react violently if he noticed her. The darkness and the storm gave her a momentary advantage, but the slightest misstep would expose her presence. She took aim, though a swirling gust of wind unsettled her stance. Conley yanked the ATV's handlebars, trying to power through. The front tire struck an unseen rock, jolting the vehicle. The engine sputtered. Her heart pounded as she waited for the perfect window to act. Meanwhile, then, in a chaotic blur, the ATV tipped. Conley lost his grip, and the machine skidded sideways, partly pinning his leg as it slid into the ditch. The duffel bag tumbled onto the soggy ground. Conley struggled to free himself, cursing in ragged gasps. He rolled onto his side, ignoring the pain, and reached desperately for the bag. Natalie saw him pull a sidearm from under his jacket, unsteady but still dangerous. She watched him crawl toward the bag, determined to salvage it even in the midst of the meltdown. Meanwhile, she recognized that confronting him directly would be risky, but the contents of that bag could not fall back into his hands. She advanced until she had a clearer line of sight, the sidearm in her hand, her finger poised above the trigger. Thunder boomed as if to punctuate the standoff. Conley looked up then, truly seeing her for the first time. A mix of disbelief and fury contorted his expression. He recognized the woman in the wheelchair from Stonebridge, the one he had likely dismissed as irrelevant. For a heartbeat, they studied each other in the strobe-like illumination of lightning. Meanwhile, the next move carried life-or-death stakes. Conley raised his weapon, but it trembled in his hand, either from the cold or from injury. Natalie braced, feeling the recoil in her mind before it happened. She saw his arm tense, aiming for her, and in a flash, she weighed her choices. The memories of her training, the infiltration, the vow to stop these criminals all surged through her. She exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot reverberated through the storm, instantly followed by thunder. Conley flinched and dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder. The firearm sank into the mud. He tried to lunge for the bag one last time, but his strength was waning. Meanwhile, in the aftermath, Natalie looked at him, a wave of conflicting emotions coursing through her. She had fired in self-defense, in the line of duty, to prevent him from destroying evidence or worse. She maintained her posture, scanning for any sign of a second wind from Conley. He grimaced in pain, struggling in the mud. His eyes flitted from the duffel bag to her sidearm, as though measuring one last desperate move. But the blood loss and the shock pinned him in place. She could see the fight draining out of him. Meanwhile, a beam of light from an arriving agent's flashlight fell upon the scene. The agent rushed forward, weapon drawn, ordering Conley to remain motionless. Another agent followed, providing cover. They swiftly secured him, checking the seriousness of his wound. One agent retrieved the duffel bag, glancing at Natalie with a nod that implied understanding and relief. They recognized that she, despite her wheelchair and the subtlety of her presence, had been crucial in preventing Conley's escape. Meanwhile, moments later, more agents arrived, including a field medic, who attended to Conley with brusque efficiency. The agent holding the bag gestured toward its contents, looking grim. It was clear that inside were not just documents but also digital devices, possible account ledgers, and perhaps cryptographic keys crucial to the Iron Serpent's network. Everything was soaked in rain and mud, but presumably salvageable. In those final moments, Conley glared at Natalie with a mixture of rage and bewilderment, as though he could not fathom how she had been the one to thwart him. Meanwhile, within the hour, the storm began to ease. The night sky remained black, but the thunder grew more distant. All around Ravenwood Bluff, federal agents methodically swept the area, detaining any remaining iron serpents or associated criminals. The helicopters returned, their searchlights revealing the devastation wrought during the firefight. The clearing looked like a battlefield, littered with spent shell casings, toppled crates, and scattered debris. A small triage area had been set up, where wounded individuals, both criminals and agents, received medical attention. The metallic clank of handcuffs punctuated the air, along with the endless drone of portable generators powering floodlights. Meanwhile, Natalie sat under a makeshift canopy a short distance from the main commotion. Her wheelchair was caked in mud, and her jacket dripped incessantly. She allowed a field medic to examine a shallow cut on her forehead, likely sustained from low-hanging branches in the chaos. The team leader approached, quietly thanking her for her role in capturing Conley and securing the bag. There was a sense that the entire infiltration, which had lasted months, was now culminating in the arrests of these major figures in the arms-smuggling syndicate. Meanwhile, even as she listened to the distant chatter of radio communications, she felt a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. Though the Iron Serpents were routed and Reagan Conley was in custody, she wondered about potential alliances that might have extended beyond him. A criminal empire of this scope rarely depended on just one leader. She recalled the rumors linking Conley to unnamed higher-ups across state lines. The duffel bag might hold leads to entire branches of their distribution chain. Yet, for the moment, Stonebridge and its surrounding communities were safer with Conley and his men apprehended. The infiltration phase was over, replaced by the methodical cleanup and follow-up investigations. Meanwhile, she looked back at the path that led into Ravenwood Bluff. In her mind's eye, she visualized the hectic firefight, the desperate attempts to flee, and the tension of the final standoff. Scenes of her life before the wheelchair flashed in her memory, her last deployment, the ambush that robbed her of her legs, and her subsequent struggle to redefine her purpose. Tonight, she felt a measure of vindication. She had not let her injuries define her limitations. Rather, she had turned the underestimation of others into a strategic advantage. Though her body still bore the scars of the past, her spirit had remained resolute. She took a measured breath, feeling the cold night air fill her lungs, and she reassured herself that, despite the danger and hardship, she had done what was necessary. Meanwhile, when dawn arrived, the rain finally slackened to a gentle drizzle. The storm clouds began to disperse, revealing a sky tinged with pale light. A wave of fatigue washed over Natalie, yet she stayed awake, observing the final hours of the operation. Federal forensics teams combed the clearing, cataloging every weapon and crate. Agents loaded captured individuals into transport vehicles, and medical teams helped the wounded. Some Stonebridge residents, shaken by the events of the previous night, quietly arrived at the edges of the blockade to witness the aftermath. Many recognized Natalie and seemed taken aback to see her in the heart of this massive law enforcement action. She felt no need to explain or defend her presence. She had done what she came to do. Meanwhile, by mid-morning, the area around Ravenwood Bluff looked drastically different. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off sections of the forest, and muddy tire tracks converged where the trucks had parked. Here and there, bullet casings glinted in the weak sunlight. Natalie took a moment to collect her drone, which she found half buried near a tree. The device was waterlogged, but she hoped the internal memory might still be recovered. It contained vital footage capturing Conley's presence and the advanced munitions. That footage might strengthen the prosecution's case if any of the arrested men attempted to deny involvement. Meanwhile, a senior agent walked over, quietly expressing appreciation for Natalie's thorough work. He informed her that she would be debriefed at a secure location and that specialized teams were already combing through the duffel bag's contents. Preliminary inspections revealed encrypted drives that might tie multiple corrupt officials and financial backers to the Iron Serpent's criminal enterprises. The senior agent added that her primary handler was coordinating the next steps and was eager to speak with her in person. Meanwhile, Natalie nodded, acknowledging that her immediate role in the field was concluded. Although she knew the potential existed for her to remain undercover, the infiltration phase was no longer viable. Her confrontation with Conley had assured that her cover was irrevocably blown. She would likely be reassigned to a new mission once the dust settled and the legal machinery took over, but for now, her focus remained on ensuring that the evidence gathered led to concrete charges against the criminals responsible. Meanwhile, she took one last look across the scene: federal vehicles arrayed in rows, the battered remains of the Iron Serpent's equipment scattered under tarps, and small groups of handcuffed men awaiting transport. She thought of Stonebridge, the small town that had seen so many of these criminals pass through its streets. Although she had never fully integrated into the community, she felt a strange connection to it, having observed its rhythms and grown accustomed to its people. She considered whether the townsfolk would ever truly know the depth of what had transpired in their midst. Perhaps it was better if many details remained secret, allowing the town to heal without the specter of a prolonged public trial overshadowing every conversation. Meanwhile, she guided her wheelchair onto a gravel path that led away from the clearing. The senior agent escorted her to a waiting transport, where she handed over her final notes and recordings. As she settled into the vehicle, she allowed herself to feel the strain of exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her for so many hours finally ebbed, leaving her shoulders heavy. She recalled the tension in the diner, the nighttime stakeouts, the whispered rumors, and the unrelenting vigilance she had to maintain every day in Stonebridge. It was over now, at least for this mission. Meanwhile, nevertheless, she remained keenly aware that while Conley had been captured, entire aspects of his network might still operate elsewhere. Large-scale arms trafficking rings did not vanish overnight. They typically reconfigured themselves, with new leaders filling any void. Natalie's mind turned to the possibility of more dangerous players stepping in, people far removed from the mountain roads and quiet towns. The advanced munitions glimpsed at Ravenwood Bluff hinted at a global supply chain. She would soon learn whether the data salvaged from the duffel bag would provide the leads needed to dismantle that chain or whether fresh obstacles awaited. Meanwhile, as the transport vehicle pulled away, she watched the receding silhouettes of the helicopters and the cordoned-off clearing. The final image she saw before the path curved was a line of agents escorting a still-defiant Jacob Grady, while medical personnel hovered around Reagan Conley, now bandaged and restrained. The storm had passed, leaving behind a raw, rain-soaked landscape where the smell of wet pine and gunpowder lingered in the air. In her mind, she marked this operation as a victory but tempered with the understanding that victory in her line of work was seldom absolute. Meanwhile, she settled against the seat, letting her eyes close. The knowledge of a job completed brought a quiet sense of accomplishment, yet she could not ignore a subtle undertow of apprehension for what might arise next. There would be a debrief, official statements, legal proceedings, and months, possibly years, of follow-up work. Other investigations would unravel, possibly requiring her particular talents again. But for the moment, she let herself drift in the aftermath, replaying fragments of the operation in her mind. She thought of the precise moment she had squeezed the trigger, preventing Conley from fleeing, and she reminded herself that every sacrifice she had made, from her legs to her sense of normalcy, served a purpose. The wheelchair was not a symbol of defeat but a testament to her relentless commitment to her mission. Meanwhile, the vehicle climbed a winding road that traversed the mountains, heading for a secure location where she would be debriefed away from the prying eyes of the media or any surviving members of the Iron Serpents. She opened her eyes briefly, glancing out the window. The storm clouds were finally breaking, revealing a swath of pale blue sky edging over distant ridges. The forest below stretched out like a vast, glimmering tapestry, still drenched from the night's tempest. In that moment, she felt a guarded optimism. Evil had been thwarted, at least here, at least for now. She did not underestimate the scope of the problem, but she allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction. Meanwhile, she thought again of Stonebridge, imagining life resuming in the diner, the supply store, and the quiet library. She wondered how the townspeople would process the revelation that a federal crackdown had ended a massive arms smuggling ring just beyond their backyard. Some would be angry, others relieved. Many might never learn the finer details. In time, she expected rumors would swirl, speculation would circulate, and the truth would remain partly shrouded in official silence. Perhaps that was for the best. The community had endured enough intimidation and uncertainty. Meanwhile, as the miles rolled by, she recalled the face of Calvin Maynard, the diner owner who offered her simple kindness. She wondered if she would ever return to Stonebridge under her true identity or whether she would remain forever a stranger who had passed through, leaving questions in her wake. The senior agent remained silent, focusing on the steep curves. Natalie felt no urge to converse. She let the hush fill the space until the hum of the engine became her lullaby. Meanwhile, eventually, they reached the perimeter of a larger regional hub, where a small convoy of unmarked vehicles waited, presumably to transport all crucial personnel and evidence to secure facilities. She was guided into a second vehicle that bore more advanced communications equipment. In the back, a field technician carefully dried the contents of the duffel bag, wiping each device before placing it into waterproof evidence pouches. Natalie observed the items briefly, noting memory sticks, portable drives, coded ledgers, and even old-fashioned notebooks with scrawled writing. She sensed that these pieces, once decrypted, would reveal the lines of supply and alliances behind the iron serpents. It struck her how a single infiltration could expose cracks in an entire criminal structure, provided the intelligence was thorough and the execution precise. Meanwhile, the ride continued into the late afternoon. The storm front had receded entirely, leaving scattered clouds drifting across a pale sky. The mountainous terrain gave way to gentler hills. Natalie felt a sense of transition, as though stepping from one chapter of her life into another. Her entire journey in Stonebridge had demanded layers of concealment: her identity, her intentions, and her capabilities. Yet no charade lasted forever. She had played her part, and now the mask would be lifted among her colleagues, though the townspeople might remain forever in the dark. She found that anonymity oddly comforting. Meanwhile, finally, the convoy arrived at a secure complex ringed by tall fences and guarded checkpoints. Uniformed officers allowed them entry, and the vehicles parked in a gated lot. Natalie was greeted by an operations coordinator who escorted her into an administration building, moving through quiet halls until they reached a debriefing room. She was invited to wait there while a small team gathered to review her statements, cross-reference her data, and align the results of the operation with official protocols. Meanwhile, alone in the room, she let out a slow breath, massaging her sore arms. The day's ordeal had pushed her wheelchair to the limit, and she could feel the tension in her shoulders and hands. She knew the hours ahead would be filled with questions. She would walk the investigators through every detail, every conversation overheard in the diner, every name gleaned from random scraps of intelligence, every vantage point from which she observed suspicious activity. She would describe her final confrontation with calmly, justifying why lethal force had been necessary to disarm him and protect the evidence. If all went well, the chain of custody for the duffel bag would be indisputable, and no defense attorney could claim it was tampered with or improperly obtained. Meanwhile, in those reflective moments, she realized how drastically her life had changed since the day she had been wheeled out of a military hospital, unsure if she could ever serve again. She had felt broken, unsure of her worth beyond the uniform she had worn and the missions she had completed with her squad. Over time, she discovered that duty could be fulfilled in unexpected ways. She had honed her skills to fit a new reality, turning the wheelchair into a discreet platform for infiltration. She had embraced the illusions that criminals often held, that a person in a wheelchair was harmless, powerless, beneath notice. She had used that prejudice against them, weaving her way into their midst and tearing down their operation from within. Meanwhile, now, after what seemed like an endless string of lonely evenings in Stonebridge, countless nights of silent surveillance, and a final storm-racked confrontation, she was at the threshold of another unknown. The debrief would close one chapter, but new ones would follow. She knew that the fight against arms traffickers, corrupt officials, and shadowy networks was ongoing. The country was vast, and criminals as resourceful and cold-blooded as Conley existed in every corner. She would likely be sent into the field again, though perhaps her injuries would necessitate a different type of role next time. She accepted that uncertainty with the quiet resolve of a soldier who had learned the cost of both war and espionage. Meanwhile, outside the debriefing room, she heard muted footsteps. She straightened, ready to give her report. Her sidearm had already been surrendered for safekeeping, leaving her only with her well-worn ID card and the intangible strength of her experiences. The door opened, and a pair of officials stepped in, each carrying thick files. They offered her a brief, measured acknowledgement, then took seats at the table, preparing to document her account of the operation. She stared at their expectant faces, understanding that she was about to relive every crucial moment, from the first day she rolled into Stonebridge to the second she pulled the trigger on Conley. Meanwhile, she inhaled once more, resolving to speak clearly and comprehensively. The path that had led her here was long, painful, and fraught with danger, but it had culminated in a successful mission. She thought of the smoldering remains of the Iron Serpent's deal, the shattered illusions of men like Jacob Grady, and the determined survival instinct that kept her going even after the ambush that cost her legs. A glimmer of confidence kindled inside her, the sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. This was not the end of her story, only another turning point. With that conviction, she began her debrief, recounting the infiltration of Stonebridge and the final battle at Ravenwood Bluff, secure in the knowledge that her role in dismantling the Iron Serpents was significant, and perhaps only a prelude to greater challenges awaiting her on the horizon. Meanwhile, Natalie spent several days in the secure complex, answering every question investigators put before her, reviewing satellite images, and corroborating intelligence gleaned from the duffel bag seized from Reagan Conley. The bright, sterile hallways were a stark contrast to the rain-soaked chaos at Ravenwood Bluff. She felt the weight of scrutiny each time officials pored over her statements, comparing them with transcripts from other agents, ensuring that every detail lined up. She sensed that the operation's magnitude demanded precision. The Iron Serpents had proven to be just one node in a sprawling network, and any gap in the evidence could allow key figures to slip away. Meanwhile, in the windowless debriefing chamber, she methodically recounted her infiltration into Stonebridge, the incremental steps she had taken to gain trust or remain beneath suspicion, and the final confrontation that led to Conley's capture. The hush of the room and the intense gazes of her superiors reminded her that success in these cases depended on perfect clarity of facts. One of the analysts occasionally tapped on a laptop, correlating her recollections with newly decrypted files from Conley's drives. They had uncovered bank transfers, coded messages, and references to overseas contacts who specialized in advanced weapon prototypes. The more data they deciphered, the more certain they became that Conley had been part of a far-reaching arrangement that extended beyond state lines, possibly even beyond the country's borders. Meanwhile, she remained silent outside of the debriefing sessions, avoiding idle conversation with staff in the corridors. Each evening, she returned to a small, private dormitory in the complex, finding it difficult to rest. She kept picturing Stonebridge's winding roads, the unwavering stares of the Iron Serpents, and the subdued kindness of Calvin Maynard at the diner. She wondered what the townspeople were doing now, how they would adapt in the wake of a large-scale federal takedown. Most had never even learned her real name. Perhaps some were relieved to see the motorcycles vanish, while others might feel a lingering anxiety about what might fill the power vacuum left by the Iron Serpent's downfall. Meanwhile, on the morning of her 5th day in the secure facility, she was summoned to a briefing that included high-level officials from multiple agencies. They had arranged chairs around a long table lined with monitors. The tension in the air was palpable, intensified by the nature of what they were about to discuss. Natalie watched as the lead investigators displayed evidence from Conley's bag. They showed scattered images of advanced munitions, cryptic references to tech labs in undisclosed locations, and partial shipping manifests for materials that could be used to manufacture high-performance explosives or experimental firearms. They then presented fresh leads indicating that a covert network of financiers had provided the Iron Serpents with consistent funding and safe transit routes. Meanwhile, she listened carefully, parsing every detail. Her time undercover offered unique insights into the smugglers' habits and the potential for corruption in remote areas. While none of the officials directed their gaze at her specifically, she felt they were silently measuring whether she might be qualified, or willing, to participate in any next step. She sensed that much bigger targets lay on the horizon, shielded by secrecy and wealth. Meanwhile, shortly afterward, she was escorted to a secure office lined with acoustic panels. Behind a thick door, an operations coordinator explained that the decrypted files hinted at a shadowy figure known only as Talbot, someone rumored to be orchestrating larger transactions across multiple states. Natalie looked at an array of grainy photos pinned to a board, featuring unidentified individuals meeting in cargo yards or private airstrips. The coordinator emphasized that Talbot dealt in specialized weapons systems, apparently bridging stolen military technology with illicit commercial innovations. Though the Iron Serpents had been significant at the regional level, Talbot seemed to be operating on a scale that threatened national security. Meanwhile, Natalie felt a prickle of concern. She had just completed a high-risk operation that nearly cost her life. Yet the data on the screen suggested she might soon be facing even more perilous tasks if called upon. She recognized the pattern: once criminals of this caliber were cornered, new alliances often formed, or dormant networks awakened to fill the void. She saw names on the digital map pinned across different regions, forming a lattice that connected black market arms dealers, unscrupulous financiers, and smaller offshoot gangs. The complexities spiraled outward, reinforcing her sense that the Ravenwood Bluff raid had simply been the opening salvo in a much longer campaign. Meanwhile, 2 more days passed with quiet urgency. The officials compared intelligence from other field offices, discovered that Talbot might have ties to foreign arms manufacturers, and identified a chain of suspicious shell companies used to launder the proceeds. Through it all, Natalie remained in the background, answering follow-up questions about her infiltration of Stonebridge, describing how local corruption had taken root, and explaining how intimidation allowed the Iron Serpents to control entire corridors of the countryside. Though physically safe within the fortified facility, she felt a growing unease about the new revelation: the blueprint for advanced weapons might have already spread beyond any single group. There were suggestions in the decrypted files that prototypes had reached multiple labs, that certain rogue scientists were perfecting technology under the promise of lavish funding. Meanwhile, eventually, she was informed that a specialized team intended to disrupt these labs, hoping to seize designs and prevent mass distribution of dangerous weapons. Some of the top officials believed her insights would be invaluable, given her background and her ability to navigate covertly without drawing the usual suspicion. She could feel the subtle pressure in their demeanor: they wanted her to volunteer. They knew she had the unique advantage of defying typical criminal expectations. Her injuries, far from being a hindrance, gave her an unexpected edge in the field. Meanwhile, she wrestled with conflicting emotions, recalling the moment she had pulled the trigger on Conley. She considered whether she had the stamina to face another infiltration so soon. The aftershocks of Stonebridge still rattled her, and she wondered if her body and mind could withstand a new operation. Yet she also recognized that refusing might mean losing the best chance to prevent deadly technology from reaching unscrupulous buyers. She thought of Stonebridge's quiet streets, the sense of relief that must have swept over them once the Iron Serpents were removed. Perhaps she could bring that same relief to other places threatened by Talbot's network. Meanwhile, late one afternoon, she found herself alone in a small courtyard within the complex, a patch of open air where agents sometimes took brief walks. The sky above was clear, and a hint of warmth brushed against her face, a sign that spring was nearing its peak. She replayed the many conversations with the investigators. They respected her achievements, but they also recognized her as a prime candidate for a new phase of operations. She found herself balancing her sense of duty against the physical toll of repeated high-risk missions. Meanwhile, after a moment of reflection, she decided that turning away now would feel like leaving a job unfinished. The data gleaned from Conley's drives made it obvious that the potential for greater harm loomed. While she knew another infiltration would be challenging, perhaps more so than the last, she could not ignore the call to serve. It was the same resolve that guided her through rigorous training, that helped her adapt to life after her injuries. She returned from the courtyard with a quiet determination, ready to rejoin the investigators and express her willingness to continue. Meanwhile, within hours, she was sitting at a table with a small circle of senior officials who supervised joint federal-state operations. They revealed that their priority target was a research facility masquerading as a startup in a coastal region, rumored to be receiving key shipments of specialized components for advanced firearms. The shipments were scheduled to pass through a labyrinth of intermediaries, each step obscured by falsified documents. If they could place an operative inside, they might intercept the technology before it reached Talbot's hands. The officials explained that they had yet to identify any local security presence, but they suspected the facility had covert ties to criminals more disciplined than the Iron Serpents. Natalie listened, noticing how each detail aligned with the sophisticated threads discovered in Conley's bag. She realized that these arms traffickers knew how to keep their operations hidden behind layers of corporate facades. Meanwhile, she and the officials went through scenario planning, imagining how she might pose as a tech consultant or a security analyst. They considered ways to downplay her wheelchair so it would draw less suspicion. In truth, her injuries might help her enter the facility under the guise of someone with no connection to law enforcement. She considered the potential challenges. A network so advanced would likely use biometric systems, encrypted communications, and possibly embedded guards with paramilitary training. She knew infiltration would require patience and resources. The officials assured her that if she agreed, they would provide specialized support, intelligence updates, and a carefully crafted legend for her new identity. She recognized that the success of such a plan depended on unwavering precision. Meanwhile, though a small voice inside her asked whether she was pushing too hard, she steadied herself. She remembered the vow she made after the ambush overseas, never to let her injuries define or confine her, but to channel her capacities toward protecting others. She nodded her understanding, and the group proceeded to finalize an outline for the infiltration. Officially, her role in Stonebridge would be categorized as a standard assignment that had concluded. Any public statements or legal processes regarding the Ravenwood Bluff raid would not include her name, ensuring that her anonymity remained intact for the next mission. Meanwhile, after days of grueling preparations, she was cleared to leave the secure facility. She had not returned to Stonebridge since departing under heavy guard, nor had she visited any of her acquaintances there. She felt a pang of nostalgia, thinking again of the quiet library and the diner. The agency's stance was that her identity would remain classified, and it would be best if she did not reappear in the town. She understood this logic but could not entirely banish the ache of leaving that chapter behind without a proper farewell. Meanwhile, she traveled to a staging area in a different state, a smaller complex dedicated to training and equipping field operatives. There, she spent weeks refining her approach, practicing with new devices designed for discreet surveillance, and adjusting to an updated wheelchair that incorporated silent propulsion and advanced sensor arrays. The concept was to have a minimal footprint in any environment, a quiet, unassuming presence that no one would question until it was too late. She worked with a small team specializing in infiltration. They taught her to replicate the mannerisms of a corporate outsider, to speak convincingly about technology and security protocols, and to modulate her body language to blend in among office workers. Meanwhile, she also learned how to handle advanced firearms in a tight time frame. While she was well versed in standard military weapons, the criminals in these rings were suspected of wielding prototypes that did not operate like the firearms she had encountered before. She spent hours at an underground range, familiarizing herself with recoil patterns, possible jamming points, and maintenance quirks of cutting-edge weapons. Her injuries forced her to adapt certain stances, but she refused to be limited by them. She devised unique methods to pivot her wheelchair, to draw quickly from concealed compartments, and to balance while firing in a seated position. Meanwhile, during these preparations, she developed a guarded friendship with a few intelligence analysts who specialized in digital infiltration. One analyst walked her through the intricacies of the shell companies tied to Talbot's network. They showed her redacted names that hinted at political ties, indicating that the risk extended beyond private criminals. She found it sobering to realize that even individuals within official circles might facilitate the trafficking of advanced arms. The knowledge renewed her determination. If the infiltration succeeded, they might expose corruption that spanned multiple jurisdictions. Lives could be saved, and entire supply lines for illegal weaponry could be severed. Meanwhile, months of careful planning led her to a moment similar to when she had first rolled into Stonebridge, only this time, her cover was established more formally. She obtained documentation identifying her as a freelance consultant hired to evaluate the security of a mid-level tech firm. The file portrayed her as an experienced wheelchair user who had worked for private clients under confidentiality agreements, giving her an air of exclusivity that might intrigue the target facility. The operation's logic hinged on the notion that criminals masquerading as legitimate entrepreneurs often sought external talent for cybersecurity or physical security reviews, allowing them to spot vulnerabilities. If she played the role convincingly, the facility might welcome her with minimal suspicion. Meanwhile, her newly issued identification had a different name, a background story carefully seeded with verifiable entries, and references to a handful of phony security projects. She was provided a specialized laptop loaded with diagnostic tools, some of which doubled as covert infiltration software. The final weeks involved rehearsals of how she would respond to certain lines of questioning and how she would dismiss any concerns about her background. She also learned to identify coded signs that a target might suspect her, ensuring she could exit swiftly if her cover was compromised. Meanwhile, then, without fanfare, she was sent on her way. An unmarked car dropped her at a modest hotel in a city bordering the coastal region where the research facility was located. She was told to await instructions on the next contact date. She found herself in the same mental space she had inhabited before arriving in Stonebridge, alone in a quiet room, wheels of an elaborate plan already turning around her. She propped up her wheelchair beside the bed, gazing at the unremarkable walls. The night stretched long and silent, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the occasional siren outside. She remembered the swirling storm at Ravenwood Bluff, the muzzle flashes, and the unstoppable surge of adrenaline. In the hush of the hotel, those memories seemed distant yet disturbingly vivid. Meanwhile, the next day, she received an encrypted message on her assigned phone. A short set of instructions directed her to the facility's front desk at a specified time. She was to introduce herself under the consultant identity. The message included an admonition that local watchers would be in place, ensuring her safety should something go awry. She took a steadying breath, reminded herself of her training, and steeled her resolve. This, she told herself, was the next logical step in the mission. She recalled the relief on the faces of Stonebridge citizens after the iron serpents were toppled and felt a surge of purpose. If she could do her part once more, perhaps entire communities would be spared the threat of advanced weaponry flooding their streets. Meanwhile, upon reaching the facility, a nondescript building set near the shore, she noted the clean architecture and the distant hum of machinery. Her initial pass revealed security cameras nested unobtrusively along the roofline. She entered through sliding glass doors, approached a receptionist, and presented her fabricated credentials. The environment had the polished veneer of a company that produced civilian electronics, though she had spent enough time reviewing the data to suspect that beneath this facade lay labs dedicated to far more dangerous pursuits. She moved slowly, feigning curiosity about the layout, while discreetly noting the presence of armed guards with concealed sidearms. Meanwhile, over the following days, she ingratiated herself into the facility's routine. She offered plausible, carefully tailored assessments of the building's software vulnerabilities, logging all suspicious signs in a hidden folder on her laptop. She sat in on technical briefings, gleaning coded hints that certain labs were off-limits without special clearance. The workers she encountered seemed professional, but she detected a subdued tension in their conversations. Now and then, a hushed comment about restricted shipments surfaced, though no one spoke openly of prototypes. If anyone questioned her wheelchair or her background, she managed to steer the conversation toward her specialized skills, leaving them mildly impressed and less prone to pry. Meanwhile, in private moments, she communicated with her handlers through an encrypted channel, providing updates on the suspicious labs. They confirmed that the facility was indeed funneling specialized materials to unknown recipients, likely linked to Talbot. She compiled times, dates, and shipping records, establishing a pattern of deliveries that matched the partial manifests found in Conley's data. Each passing night, she returned to her modest apartment, set up by the agency, quietly sifting through the day's observations. Meanwhile, one evening, she noticed a discrepancy in the digital logs. A particular batch of circuit boards left the facility without any record of a receiving destination. She cross-referenced the shipping date with the logs from Conley's drives and found a perfect match for a coded reference that implied advanced targeting modules. She realized that these circuit boards might be integrated into experimental firearms, effectively turning them into precision-guided devices. The gravity of this revelation sharpened her resolve to dig deeper. She felt a sense of déjà vu, recalling how each lead in Stonebridge had unraveled a larger scheme. Meanwhile, yet infiltration was always dangerous. Over the next week, she picked up signs that not everyone accepted her presence. A mid-ranking security officer watched her too intently, making her wonder if the corporate front had begun to suspect a mole. She stayed vigilant, adjusting her behavior to appear unthreatening. She rehearsed plausible denials in case someone challenged her. Through careful self-control and the advantage of her unassuming wheelchair-bound demeanor, she managed to maintain her cover. Meanwhile, late one night, she received a covert message that a high-value shipment was leaving the facility at dawn. The instructions from her handlers were clear: identify its route, document the receivers, then exfiltrate before suspicions turned into direct confrontation. She prepared a small drone, reminiscent of the one she had used near the sawmill in Stonebridge, though this model was more advanced and nearly silent. At first light, she positioned herself near a side exit to watch for the promised departure. Sure enough, two unmarked cargo vans rolled out of a rear loading dock. She followed them with her drone, capturing footage of their license plates and direction of travel. The vehicles converged on a private airstrip, where she observed men transferring crates onto a waiting cargo plane. She zoomed in, capturing the entire event digitally. She noted the presence of heavily armed escorts who moved with a calm efficiency, reminiscent of paramilitary backgrounds. Meanwhile, satisfied with the evidence collected, she relayed it to her handlers, who indicated that a larger team would intercept the operation once the cargo plane reached a scheduled refueling stop. She exhaled, relieved that the mission was nearing success. However, she recognized that her infiltration of the facility might now be compromised. If word reached the corporate front that the plane had been seized, suspicion would fall on any new consultant, especially one whose background was only superficially verified. Meanwhile, later that afternoon, she prepared to slip away from the building, having made an excuse about needing to finalize her reports off-site. The moment she exited the security checkpoint, she noticed a figure lingering near the parking lot, the mid-ranking officer who had watched her with particular scrutiny. His expression hinted at distrust, and he seemed to be communicating through a discreet earpiece. The tension was immediate. She maneuvered her wheelchair toward a side corridor, ignoring the suspicious gaze, her mind racing through escape scenarios. The facility had multiple layers of locked doors, and she had minimal time to reach her car or vanish into the city streets. Meanwhile, she turned a corner, feigning calm while searching for an exit route that would not be blocked. Suddenly, she sensed a shift in the corridor's energy. At the far end, she glimpsed another staff member walking swiftly in her direction, an unsettling intensity in his posture. She had expected the possibility of a confrontation, but not so soon. Her laptop, loaded with incriminating data, was secured in a hidden compartment of her wheelchair. She could not afford to let them detain her or confiscate that evidence. She recalled the Stonebridge infiltration, the night she escaped a possible ambush by employing the silent motors on her chair. Now, she would need every ounce of ingenuity to break free from a heavily monitored compound. Meanwhile, she angled her chair down a narrow hallway that led to a freight elevator. The door slid open with an echoing clang, revealing an empty platform meant for large deliveries. She rolled inside and hit the button for the ground level. The descent felt interminably long. She kept one hand near the hidden sidearm compartment, her pulse pounding in her ears. When the elevator finally opened, she emerged into a loading area that connected to a service driveway. She recognized it from her earlier reconnaissance. If she could make it out the rolling steel doors, she would be near a gate that led onto a side street. Meanwhile, as she approached the doors, an alarm klaxon suddenly filled the air. Red lights flashed overhead, painting the walls with ominous color. She quickened her pace, the wheelchair's motor humming low. A security guard stepped into view, blocking her path, hand drifting to a holstered weapon. She recalled her training, how to remain calm even in a hair-trigger moment. She did not slow down. Instead, she gripped the wheelchair controls with unwavering focus. At the last second, she diverted slightly to the guard's left, causing him to pivot in confusion. She activated a burst of power from the chair's modified motor, enough to slip past him before he could fully block her. He yelled something, possibly ordering her to stop, but she pressed forward, reaching the rolling steel door. Meanwhile, the door was partially lowered, leaving a gap barely large enough for her chair. She crouched low, feeling metal scrape the top of her backrest as she shot through the narrow opening. The clamorous alarm rang behind her, echoing in the concrete loading area. She found herself on the service driveway, accelerating toward the gate. The cold air hit her, a contrast to the stifling corridor. She spotted two vehicles parked near the gate, but no one was inside them. In the distance, city traffic rushed by, oblivious to the unfolding drama behind the fence. Meanwhile, she raced to the side gate, entering a code she had acquired during her infiltration to unlock it from the inside. The gate clanked open, and she slid out, turning onto the sidewalk. Pedestrians gave her odd looks, alerted by the alarm's echo. She took a breath, scanning for any sign of pursuit. The facility's security staff might hesitate to engage her in public, especially without drawing unwanted attention from local law enforcement. She aimed for her car, a nondescript sedan parked a few blocks away, carefully chosen for its anonymity. Once inside, she used a handheld device to connect with her handlers, reporting a probable compromise of her cover and her successful exit. Meanwhile, her hands trembled slightly as she placed the wheelchair in the trunk, mindful that time was of the essence. She settled behind the steering wheel, started the engine, and merged into traffic, forcing herself to maintain a measured speed. Her mind buzzed with adrenaline, replaying the abrupt alarm, the suspicious officer, and the guard who nearly stopped her. She gripped the wheel, reminding herself she had done what was necessary to safeguard the data. Meanwhile, over the next hour, she navigated winding city streets, taking various turns to ensure no one was tailing her. When she finally reached a safe house designated by her agency, she parked discreetly at the rear. Inside the safe house, she transferred the files from her laptop to a secure server, verifying that each critical piece of evidence was intact. She confirmed that the cargo plane had been intercepted. Agents discovered crates with advanced targeting modules consistent with the technology described in Conley's data. The plan had worked. Talbot's supply lines had been disrupted, though no sign of Talbot himself emerged from the seizure. Meanwhile, the safe house was minimal, containing a cot, a desk, and basic amenities. She settled onto the cot, feeling her heart rate slow, the tension of the day still coiled in her muscles. The infiltration had not ended as smoothly as she hoped. There was an unresolved sense that the facility's security team would soon realize exactly what she had done. They might attempt to track her. She reminded herself that her agency had contingencies, that additional teams were monitoring the area. Still, she found little comfort in that knowledge. The quiet threat of retribution hovered in her thoughts, much like the earlier fear in Stonebridge when she had to remain hidden among dangerous criminals. Meanwhile, news eventually filtered through that the authorities were expanding their investigation into the shell companies behind the facility. Natalie's stolen data pointed to bank accounts scattered across different countries. Analysts theorized that Talbot had a network of local partners who specialized in funneling prototypes into legitimate supply chains, making them nearly impossible to trace once they reached the open market. This revelation underscored the complexity of the mission. Taking down the iron serpents and halting shipments at this facility were victories, but the deeper conspiracy might require multiple strikes across various jurisdictions. Meanwhile, she tried to rest that night, but a swirl of thoughts kept her awake. She recounted her days in Stonebridge, the infiltration into the research facility, and the possibility that a single miscalculation might unravel her new cover identities. She felt fatigue born not just of physical effort, but of continuous mental vigilance. The life she led demanded it. She thought of those who had dismissed her because of her wheelchair and how she had capitalized on their ignorance time after time. Yet that advantage came at a cost. She rarely formed genuine connections and constantly had to move on once a mission ended, leaving fragments of a life behind. Meanwhile, at dawn, she woke to a coded message from her handlers. It informed her that local law enforcement had responded to a reported security breach at the facility, but the company representatives were vague about what transpired. The alarm was noted, and an internal investigation was underway, though they withheld any mention of stolen data. She recognized that the criminals likely wanted to avoid a public scandal that would draw more scrutiny. The agency recommended she lay low until further notice, not returning to the facility or the city center. Meanwhile, days passed in a haze of caution. She maintained contact with her handlers, learned that the advanced targeting modules seized from the cargo plane were stored in a government lab for study, and gleaned that the evidence from her infiltration would be pivotal in prosecuting key figures. Yet Talbot's name remained an enigma. No one arrested so far had provided a definitive identity or location. Most suspects either denied knowledge or claimed only to have dealt with intermediaries. It became increasingly clear that Talbot operated behind layers of obfuscation. Natalie deduced that if Talbot learned of her infiltration success, there might be attempts on her life or a broader move to reclaim the lost hardware. Meanwhile, she chose not to linger in the safe house for too long. When clearance finally arrived from her agency, she relocated to a temporary base in a distant region, carrying the unrelenting knowledge that this entire saga had only reached a midpoint. The operation to uncover Talbot, the architecture of illegal labs, the flow of experimental weapons, all of it stretched beyond the boundaries of what she alone could resolve. Yet she found solace in the part she had already played. By exposing the facility's shipments and orchestrating the interception of the cargo plane, she had prevented advanced weaponry from entering dangerous hands. She told herself that every barrier placed in the path of criminals bought time for more decisive action and saved lives. Meanwhile, a quiet morning found her in a small cabin near a lake, owned by the agency under a nondescript holding company. The water's surface was calm, reflecting a wide sky layered with thin clouds. She watched the ripples made by a gentle breeze, absorbing the stillness. She had rarely taken time to reflect since leaving Stonebridge. Only now did she consider how each mission shaped her perspective. She remembered the intense nights in the diner, the precarious stakeouts by the sawmill, and the final push to corner Conley. Those images interlaced with her recent dash through the facility's corridors, the alarm blaring behind her. She let out a measured breath, allowing herself to acknowledge the fear she had felt in those moments. Meanwhile, she understood that once her superiors analyzed the data from this second infiltration, they might ask her to continue working on the Talbot case. She did not shy away from that possibility. Perhaps it was her destiny to operate in the shadows, leveraging the wheelchair she had once viewed as a symbol of loss. Now, it was her silent ally, granting her camouflage among those who never expected a formidable operative in such an unassuming package. Meanwhile, she lingered by the lake for some time, the cabin's silence broken only by birdsong and the rustle of pine needles. She resolved to stay alert for further instructions, to stand ready if the fight against Talbot's network demanded her return. Her life had shifted from a single infiltration in a small town to a broader campaign against an elusive threat that spanned continents. Stonebridge was behind her, but its memory fueled her commitment. One mission had ended, another had already begun, and she was caught in the unrelenting current of events that allowed little respite. Yet her spirit remained intact, a testament to her resilience. She had become more than a veteran with scars, she was a crucial instrument in the defense of her country, armed with cunning, determination, and a fierce understanding of how to turn perceived weakness into potent strength. Meanwhile, she gazed again at the lake's still surface, thinking of the reflection it offered. Beneath that quiet expanse lay hidden depths. Unseen currents that mirrored the covert struggles shaping her own path. She considered the countless others who, like her, had been wounded yet refused to be broken, finding ways to serve with unwavering resolve. The knowledge that she was part of something larger, something dedicated to protecting innocent lives, kept her anchored. With that certainty, she allowed herself one brief moment of calm, resting on the porch of the cabin. She sensed that the next call would come sooner rather than later, summoning her once again into the unknown. When it did, she would be prepared, ready to roll forward on wheels that never stopped, no matter how rough the road might become.